Rafael Nadal was not a fan of the ATP's experiment with blue clay. While the Spaniard was the king of clay, let's face it, 14 French Opens will never be beaten, he wasn't impressed at all about stepping onto the deep ocean blue turf. Novak Djokovic also hated this initiative. Chris Clarey's enlightening book, The Warrior, covers Nadal's ascent to prominence on clay, the ATP's dalliance with blue, and a look at Nadal's tangled relationship with the French Open and French society. In this video, I'll tell you about the main themes in the book and give you my honest thoughts on it. Now, while Nadal won the Madrid Open 5 times, he fumed at ATP leadership for letting the Madrid Open switch from the traditional red clay to blue clay. He slipped around the court and said, "If this continues, there will be one less tournament in my calendar next year." So back then in 2012, there was a chance that the players could step off the court looking like blue Smurfs rather than covered in the red dirt. Tellingly, the event went back to red clay 1 year later. Now, Clarey covers how at the time, Madrid Open tournament officials were absolutely adamant that the clay they were using was the same as that at Roland Garros. So much so they even had the support of Gaston Kloop, who at the time was in charge of maintaining the courts at Roland Garros. Kloop then went on record saying that the Madrid Open's blue clay was authentic, traditionally made with brick and limestone, and that it would play exactly like the second major of the year. Nadal, who also disliked the fact that Madrid was played at altitude, said, "You don't see red grass. Wow, what a sick burn," and presumably he raised his eyebrow while saying this. And despite Serena Williams and Roger Federer taking home the singles titles this year, the tournament was panned for its slippery surface. The New York Times commented that Williams and Federer had now won titles on 4 surfaces: clay, grass, hard, and ice. One man left skating towards a bad fall was Novak Djokovic, who, let's face it, should have been used to the wintry conditions considering how much of a keen skier he is. And this was just an absolute PR disaster for the ATP and the Madrid Open, the organisers of which were probably left feeling, I don't know, blue. So either way, the experiment was never repeated again. Well, yet. So having won a record 81 clay court matches between 2005 and 2007, we already know how imperious Nadal was on clay courts. And some of my fondest memories of watching tennis as a youngster include seeing Nadal at the back of the court just retrieving absolutely every ball through sheer will with that red dirt covering those white long pirate shorts he used to wear. So one thing which Clarey asks is just why did Nadal take to clay like a duck to water, especially when the Spaniard said that his favourite surface to play on was actually grass. Mats Wilander said that practicing with Nadal on clay was like climbing a ladder over and over again. And John Isner, who in another era maybe could have won a couple of slams, said that Nadal just has a motor that never ends. Now, one element which Clarey picks out in terms of why Nadal was so dominant on clay was his ability to slide on the court. Clarey, who has actually worked as a tennis coach, said that the best players on clay will actually slide before their opponent has hit the ball, so that anticipation and timing was something that Nadal just always had in his favour. On any surface, he also had a sky-high tennis IQ and just an unbreakable defence, which particularly on clay was always so important. In terms of his defence, he just never gave an inch, and in the book, Clarey actually quotes Nadal as saying, "Get better or you're dead." And that pretty much just sums up his mentality and his approach to just going absolutely all guns blazing to win every single point. Nadal's greatness on clay was such that he embarrassed the legendary Roger Federer for the loss of just 4 games in the 2008 French Open final. It says a lot about Rafa's humility that he almost acted quite sheepishly at the end, as if he was sorry for how soundly he'd beaten his rival. I've always wondered if maybe Nadal's left-handedness also made such a difference on clay. Another thing which Clarey writes about is that Nadal's level of top spin, he actually put around 5,000 revolutions per minute on his ground strokes, and if you compare that to Agassi, who put around 1,800 on his ground strokes. The difference in terms of spin is just incredible. The way Nadal hit his forehand with a straight arm, it made it so that he had an incredible amount of spin, as we discussed, but he also didn't compromise on speed. So there was really no other player like that on the tour. Now, in the book, Clarey also writes a little bit of a love letter to clay court tennis in general, and he writes a really nice potted history of the surface. And while many players thought the blue courts were a bit shit, there was actually still many courts which were actually made of dung right up until the 1990s, especially in India. You can just imagine being a breakdown in one of these tournaments. I mean, there you'd really be in the brown stuff. And poo jokes aside, Clarey also covers how the French Open grounds came to have their name, Roland Garros. The French Open Davis Cup captain Pierre Gilloux and Stade Francais chairman Émile Lesueur actually bought the grounds in 1928. Now, Gilloux was actually a friend of Roland Garros, who was in fact an aviator who was actually caught by the Germans in 1915. Some years later, he actually dressed as a German, managed to escape, and then was later killed in 1918 in combat. So closer to present day, one of the other foremost people in French tennis was actually Philippe Chatrier, whose name also adorns the French Open's main court. Chatrier made his reputation in the 1960s when he was the first person to arrange open tournaments, if you will. Now, these were really the first occasion in which amateurs and professionals had played each other. Chatrier was also instrumental in arranging the first French Open tournament in 1968. This event was almost cancelled due to local unrest, when workers went on strike over working conditions, pay, and France's authoritarian government. Clarey also writes about Chatrier's role in establishing tennis as an Olympic sport in 1984. So really, as well as doing huge things for French tennis, he really helped the sport take global strides. So while the French Open was of course always Nadal's domain, he actually had quite a strained relationship with the French public at times. This is something which is really heavily covered in another book called Rafa by John Carlin, which was released in 2011. That was a really, really good read. It might be a little bit dated now. I haven't read it for a couple of years, but yeah, I would definitely recommend that too. Nadal's uncle and coach Tony Nadal pulled no punches when he said there is only one crowd which is stupider than the French, and that is the Parisians. So when Robin Soderling handed Nadal his first ever defeat at the French Open in round 4 in 2009, the Parisian crowd actually basically cheered every one of Nadal's errors. I don't know if this was just because they wanted to see a different winner, but later Nadal was actually really upset and said he didn't really understand the hate that was coming his way. Then in 2012, the French newspaper Les Guignols basically just started casting aspersions, and they printed a cartoon of Nadal with bulging biceps and holding a syringe. In 2011, Yannick Noah, who was the last Frenchman to win the French Open, wrote a piece in Le Monde. He said they, meaning the Spanish, they run faster than us, they're sturdier than us, and they leave us only crumbs. This was at a time when the 3-time Tour de France winner from Spain, Alberto Contador, had just tested positive for clenbuterol. Noah went on and said the best approach is just to accept doping. Nadal described this as completely stupid. He said, when one guy says this, especially an important man like him, it is just terrible. A former Minister for Health, Youth and Sport of the French government, Roselyne Bachelot, claimed Nadal had been absent from the tour because of a doping suspension and not, as was reported in the press, an injury. In fact, later on, Nadal actually sued Bachelot for 10 grand. So I think it's fair to say that Nadal hasn't always had a brilliant relationship with French tennis and its administrators and the media, but they do very much acknowledge and recognise his impact, to such an extent that in 2023 a statue of Nadal was actually erected at the foot of the steps where you come into Roland Garros. We also mustn't forget the French Open announcer Marc Maury. So when Maury was doing the announcements for the players before they were walking onto the court, he actually started listing every one of the years, one by one, in which Nadal had won this Grand Slam. So can you imagine being Nadal's opponent and just waiting for the 14 years to be listed? You know, you're going to be sitting there for 5 minutes just listening to everything this absolute monster has won in the sport. So what are my final thoughts on this book then? I think it's a really interesting study of clay court tennis and also of Nadal's psyche as well. And Clarey, I think, writes with real admiration about Nadal's achievements in the sport, and he said that he wanted to embody Nadal's level of grit and determination and work ethic when he was writing the book. And in terms of the level of research and detail, I think, he definitely did that, so you have to hand it to Clarey. Throughout the book, Tony Nadal, of course, gets quite a bit of coverage, as I mentioned, and there's one part of the book where he recalls Tony saying that sport really should be about, empowerment and achievement and improvement rather than enjoyment. And I thought it was really interesting because Nadal's compatriot Carlos Alcaraz, one of his biggest strengths is just being able to enjoy what he's doing. Clarey also recounts how Tony was basically consumed by table tennis until he saw the great maverick Ilie Nastase, and it's quite interesting how, an absolute joker like Nastase could really inspire a workhorse like Tony Nadal. But there you go, I think that's a great thing about sport, the contrasting characters. Clarey also debunks the myth that Tony basically asked Rafa to start playing left-handed to create all these kind of different angles. So in the book, we learn that Rafael actually played double-handed on both sides as a junior, but because he was left-footed when playing football, incidentally, he could have been a really decent footballer. Because of that left-footedness, that's why he decided to actually play left-handed in tennis as well. So yeah, I thought this was really a immersive look into Rafael Nadal's career and his relationship with clay court tennis. And I think although I did learn a little bit more from John Carlin's book Rafa, which I've also just mentioned, I would definitely recommend Clarey's work here. If you're also interested in Roger Federer, Clarey wrote a great book about the Swiss legend called The Master. I read that many, many years ago. And again, it's got that real kind of signature flair and warmth to the writing that Clarey always brings. So that pretty much sums up my thoughts. So thanks for watching and see you soon.